My name is Franklin. They say the camera never lies, but in 1987, something went wrong. The year was 1987. Chicago was a city of iron, brick, and gray slush that never seemed to melt. The skyline was a jagged comb of steel, and the air smelled of burnt rubber, cheap tobacco, and the ozone scent of thousands of humming electronics. While the rest of the world was chasing the neon lights of disco and the hollow promises of Wall Street, Thomas worked in the basement. The Municipal Visual Archive was located 3 floors below the street level of a nondescript government building on the edge of the industrial district. It was a tomb of magnetic tape, miles and miles of VHS cassettes, stacked in industrial steel racks that reached the sweating concrete ceiling. Thomas was an auditor, a fancy word for a man who sat in a windowless room for 8 hours a night, watching the static of a dying city. His job was simple, mind-numbing, and essential. He monitored the tapes from the city's early traffic cameras and security loops. He had to ensure the equipment was working, log any incidents, and then, most importantly, bulk erase the tapes so they could be sent back out for reuse. The city was cheap. Tape was expensive. Thomas lived his life in flickers of black and white. His world was the grainy low resolution of 240 lines. He watched empty intersections at 3 a.m. He watched the back doors of post offices. He watched the lonely movements of night shift janitors. He was the ghost in the machine. A man paid to forget everything he saw. The weather that November was particularly brutal. A persistent, freezing rain turned the streets above into a slick, black nightmare. Down in the basement, the heat was erratic. Thomas sat wrapped in a heavy wool cardigan, the blue glow of 4 Sony monitors reflecting in his glasses. The only sound was the rhythmic clack-whir of the VCRs and the distant hum of the ventilation system. It happened on a Tuesday. Thomas was processing a batch of tapes from the North Side Industrial Park. Most of them were dead air. Hours of empty loading docks and rain-slicked asphalt. But the third tape in the stack was different. It had no label, no municipal barcode, no date. He slid it into the player. The machine groaned, the head spinning up with a high-pitched whine. The screen didn't show an intersection. It didn't show a street. The camera was positioned high in a corner, looking down into what appeared to be a sterile, white-tiled, cold storage room. There were no windows. In the center of the room sat a heavy industrial table. 2 men entered the frame. They weren't wearing police uniforms or janitor coveralls. They were wearing expensive tailored wool suits, protected by thin, transparent plastic aprons. They looked like accountants prepared for a messy lunch. They didn't speak. In the grainy, silent footage, their movements were methodical. They began to bring in boxes. Not just any boxes. They were the bright, colorful packaging of high-end Japanese televisions. Zenith, Panasonic, Sony. One man opened a heavy, stainless steel cooler. He reached inside and pulled out something wrapped in a clear medical bag. It was heavy. It had the distinct shape and dark bruised color of a human liver. He didn't handle it with the reverence of a surgeon. He handled it like a butcher. He placed it inside the Sony television box, surrounded it with styrofoam packing peanuts, and sealed the lid with heavy brown tape. Thomas froze. He leaned closer to the monitor, his breath fogging the glass. The second man held up a clipboard. He checked a name off a list, then slapped a pre-printed shipping label onto the side of the TV box. Thomas squinted. The resolution was poor, but he could make out the destination on the label. The Heights Medical Plaza. Private wing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a back alley deal. This was a logistics operation. The men continued. For 45 minutes, Thomas watched them pack a dozen televisions. livers, kidneys, hearts, even a pair of lungs, all pulled from the cooler, all packed into consumer electronics boxes, all labeled for delivery to the most expensive hospitals and private estates in the state. Then, the man with the clipboard looked up. He didn't look at his partner. He looked directly at the camera. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look guilty. He checked his watch, nodded to the lens, and the screen cut to black. Then, the static returned. Thomas sat in the dark, the white noise of the empty tape filling the room. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the tape player. The record light on the console was flickering. He realized two things in that moment. First, he had just seen the supply chain of a shadow economy, a system where the poor were harvested to keep the rich living forever, hidden behind the mundane labels of the 80s consumer boom. Second, he realized why the tape had no label. It hadn't been sent to the archive by mistake. It was an invitation. He looked at the shelf where he had picked up the tape. There was another one next to it, also unlabeled. He reached for it, his hand trembling. He knew he should destroy them. He knew he should walk out of the basement and never look back. But in 1987, in the heart of the Iron City, curiosity was more dangerous than the cold. He pushed the second tape into the machine. The image flickered to life. It was a bedroom. A small, cramped apartment with a messy desk and a stack of VHS tapes on the floor. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. The camera was positioned behind a vent in the wall. It was filming the room he was sitting in right now, but it wasn't the basement. It was his home. In the video, Thomas was sitting on his bed, eating a sandwich, staring at the television. He watched his past self for a moment. Then, in the video, the door to his apartment opened. A man in a tailored suit walked in. He didn't look around. He walked straight to the refrigerator, opened a small cooler he brought with him, and placed something inside. He turned to the camera, checked his watch, and nodded. The tape ended. Thomas stood up, his chair clattering against the concrete. He realized that the audit wasn't just about the city's cameras. It was about him. He wasn't just watching the system. He was part of the inventory. The basement suddenly felt like the inside of a ribcage. Thomas stared at the blank monitors, the static reflecting in his eyes like a snowstorm. The realization was a cold needle in his spine. They weren't just watching him. They were documenting his shelf life. He didn't go home that morning. He couldn't. The image of the man in the suit placing a cooler in his refrigerator, his own refrigerator where he kept his milk and his beer, was a violation that made him want to vomit. Instead, he stayed in the archive. If the system was built on tapes, the truth had to be buried somewhere in the miles of plastic ribbon surrounding him. He began to pull tapes at random, but with a new logic. He stopped looking at traffic cameras. He started looking at industrial maintenance and sanitation logs. By 4 a.m., the table in front of him was covered in black plastic shells. He had found a pattern. In the 80s, the buzzword was efficiency. The corporations called it urban renewal, but on the tapes, it looked like a liquidation sale. Thomas watched footage from a homeless shelter in the West Side. It wasn't a riot or a fire. It was a bus, a plain white bus with no markings that pulled up every Friday night. Men in those same tailored suits, shielded by the anonymity of the fog, would usher dozens of people inside. They weren't being relocated. They were being sourced. Thomas found a tape labeled Project, Golden Hour. It was a recording of a boardroom meeting, likely captured by a security camera someone forgot to turn off. The men in the room were titans of industry: steel magnates, pharmaceutical lobbyists, and city officials. The biological deficit is widening, one man said, his voice distorted by the cheap microphone. The elite clients in the North don't want to wait for donors. They want compatibility. They want freshness. And the surplus population? Another asked. The surplus population is our greatest raw material. We have the logistics. We have the hospitals. And thanks to our friends in the archive, we have no record of their existence once they enter the system. Thomas felt the room spin. He was the friend in the archive. Every time he pressed the bulk erase button, he wasn't just clearing a tape. He was deleting a person. He was the man who turned a kidnapping into static. He was the final stage of the murder. The industrial thriller turned visceral when he popped in a tape marked with a hand-drawn red cross. It was a training video. Not for doctors, but for extractors. It showed a warehouse floor converted into a high-speed assembly line. There were no white coats here, only heavy rubber aprons and power tools. It was a factory of flesh. The speed was the most horrifying part. How quickly a human being could be disassembled into profitable components. Lungs, corneas, heart valves, skin grafts. Everything was barcoded. Everything was 1980s corporate precision applied to the unthinkable. Suddenly, the intercom on Thomas's desk hissed to life. It was a sound that usually meant the night watchman was checking in, but the watchman had been dead for 2 years, replaced by an automated system. "Thomas," a voice whispered through the speaker. It was calm, professional, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the voice of the man from the boardroom tape. "Thomas, you're working overtime. That wasn't in the budget." Thomas froze. He looked at the camera in the corner of his room. The little red light wasn't just on. It was pulsing. "You've been a very efficient auditor," the voice continued. "You've erased thousands of hours of noise for us. You should be proud. You've kept the city running. You've kept the right people alive." "Who are you?" Thomas managed to choke out. "We are the shareholders, Thomas, and we've noticed you've stopped erasing. You're starting to accumulate data. And in this economy, data is a liability." The heavy steel door of the archive room hissed. The electronic lock, controlled from somewhere far above, clicked into the locked position. Thomas ran to the door, pulling at the handle. It didn't budge. He was trapped in the tomb he had helped build. "Don't worry," the voice said, sounding almost sympathetic. "We've already updated your file. You were always a high-quality match. Rare blood type, clean medical history. We've been investing in your health for years. All those vitamins the company clinic gave you, those weren't for your cold, Thomas. They were for the client." Thomas backed away from the door, his eyes darting to the monitors. All 4 screens suddenly flickered to the same image. It was a live feed of the hallway outside his room. 2 men in tailored suits were walking toward his door. They weren't carrying guns. They were carrying a heavy stainless steel cooler and a spool of industrial plastic wrap. They weren't coming to kill him. They were coming to harvest him. Thomas looked at the racks of tapes. He looked at the heavy bulk eraser, a powerful electromagnet used to wipe tapes in seconds. It was his only tool, his only weapon. He realized then that in 1987, if you weren't the one watching, you were the one being watched. And if you weren't the auditor, you were the audit. The archive room was no longer a workspace. It was a pre-op chamber. Thomas could hear the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of the men in the hallway, the steady, unhurried pace of professionals who knew their prey had nowhere to run. He looked at the bulk eraser on his desk. It was a heavy slate-gray box with a thick power cord, designed to generate a magnetic field strong enough to scramble every particle of iron oxide on a tape in a split second. To his left, the steel racks of the archive groaned under the weight of 100,000 lives he had already deleted. Thomas didn't have a weapon, but he had the tapes. He grabbed a handful of heavy VHS shells and jammed them into the door's internal mechanism through the narrow gap in the frame. The plastic crunched, the black ribbon spilling out like entrails, creating a temporary, jagged wedge. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy him seconds. He turned to the ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was thick with decades of gray dust, the metal louvers vibrating with the hum of the building's iron lungs. Using a heavy metal tape rewinder as a makeshift hammer, he began to smash at the screws. Each blow echoed through the basement like a tolling bell. Clang, clang. In the hallway, the footsteps stopped. Then, the sound of a key card sliding into the lock. Beep red. Access denied because of the jammed tape. Then came the voice again, through the intercom, distorted and buzzing with static. "Thomas, you're damaging the equipment. That's a deduction from your final valuation. Don't make this messy. A clean harvest is better for everyone." Thomas ignored the voice. He kicked the grate in. The metal gave way with a screech, revealing a dark, rectangular throat smelling of grease and stagnant air. He hauled himself up, his wool cardigan snagging on the sharp edges of the duct. As he pulled his legs into the crawl space, the office door behind him shivered. The men in suits weren't using a battering ram. They were using a hydraulic spreader, the kind firemen use to pry open car wrecks. The steel frame of the door groaned, bending like cardboard. Thomas scrambled through the duct. It was a lightless maze of galvanized tin. Every movement he made sent a booming thunder through the ventilation system, announcing his position to the entire building. He reached a junction and peered through a vent. Below him was the processing wing he had seen on the tapes. The reality was worse than the grainy footage. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights, the room was a nightmare of 80s industrial efficiency. Long conveyor belts moved quietly. Blue plastic bins were stacked against the walls, each labeled with a department code: C4, cardiac; R1, renal; O2, ocular. The smell hit him through the vent, a suffocating mix of industrial-grade bleach and the sickly sweet copper tang of fresh blood. He saw a woman on a gurney. She was wearing a tattered coat, likely picked up from the West Side bus. She wasn't screaming. She was staring at the ceiling with wide, vacant eyes, her breathing shallow under the influence of a paralytic. A man in a plastic apron was calibrating a pneumatic bone saw, the air compressor hissing like a serpent. Thomas felt a cold, jagged anger override his fear. This wasn't just a crime. It was an audit of the human soul, reduced to a ledger of parts. He kept moving, his hands scraped raw by the rivets in the duct. He followed the sound of the massive cooling fans, heading toward the rear of the building where the industrial waste was expelled. The duct narrowed. The air grew colder, smelling of the freezing Chicago rain. He reached a final grate and looked out. He was 20 feet above an alleyway, positioned directly over the massive industrial trash compactors. But he wasn't alone. A security camera, mounted on a rusted pivot, slowly turned toward him. Its lens zoomed with a mechanical whir click. "Found you," the intercom in the alleyway crackled. The door to the alley burst open. The two men from the basement stepped out into the rain. Their suits were still perfect, their plastic aprons spotted with dark droplets. One of them held a long, thin needle, a tranquilizer dart gun used for large animals. "End of the line, Thomas," the man said, raising the weapon. "You're a universal donor. Do you know how rare that is? You're worth more than this entire building. It's a waste to let you die in the dirt." Thomas looked at the camera, then at the heavy power cables running along the wall next to his vent. These were the main feeds for the archive's servers, the lifeblood of the city's erasure system. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bulk eraser. He had brought it with him, the heavy cord trailing behind him in the duct like a tail. "You want the data?" Thomas yelled, his voice cracking. "You want to erase everything?" He didn't jump. Instead, he jammed the bulk eraser directly into the high-voltage junction box next to the vent and flipped the switch. The magnetic surge was instantaneous and violent. A massive blue arc of electricity leaped from the box, grounding through the metal ducts. The bulk eraser screamed, its internal coils melting, creating a localized electromagnetic pulse. Every monitor in the building exploded in a shower of sparks. The security camera above Thomas's head shrieked and began to smoke. In the processing wing, the conveyor belts ground to a halt. But most importantly, in the basement, the magnetic field tore through the racks of tapes. Millions of hours of evidence, the only records of the thousands of people the corporation had harvested, were being wiped clean in a chaotic wave of magnetic fury. The men in the alley collapsed as the electrical discharge traveled through the wet pavement. Thomas kicked the vent open and leaped into the darkness of the trash compactor, the cold rain hitting his face like a baptism. He was out. But as he scrambled over the bags of shredded paper and medical waste, he saw the city lights flickering. The entire block was pulsing with the rhythm of a dying machine. He hadn't just escaped. He had triggered a system-wide crash. And in 1987, when the tape stops, the real horror begins. The silence of the aftermath. The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But we're a grateful company. We don't like to waste talent. You're very good at watching. You're very good at identifying patterns." The man handed Thomas a small plastic card. It was a new ID badge. It had Thomas's photo, but a different name, L. Croft. "There's a new archive being built in the suburbs," the man said, "under a place called Greenwich Valley. It's much more modern. No more tapes. It's all going digital. We need someone who knows how to handle the silence." Thomas looked at the badge. His mind broke. He saw the logic of the machine. It was a circle. You can't fight the tape. You can only be recorded, erased, or played back. "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. The man tapped the stainless steel cooler sitting on the sidewalk next to him. "Then we go back to the original plan, the universal donor plan. Either way, Thomas, you're going to help the company. It's just a matter of whether you do it with your eyes open or from inside a box labeled Sony television." The man walked away, his footsteps echoing in the foggy morning. Thomas stood alone in the phone booth. He looked at the city, his city, and saw it for what it truly was. It wasn't a place for people. It was a giant, hungry VCR, constantly recording, constantly consuming, and waiting for the next auditor to press erase. He looked at the ID badge in his hand. Then he looked at the trash compactor down the street. He didn't run. He didn't scream. Thomas adjusted his glasses, wiped the blood from his cheek, and began to walk toward the train station. He had a new shift starting, and in 1987, the work never ends.